Good evening. I would like to welcome everyone to our June 2nd, 2015 meeting of the City of Everett Planning Commission. And we'll start out with our roll call.
Chair Stewart.
Here.
Commissioner Sand.
Here.
Commissioner Adams.
Here.
Commissioner Tisdale.
Here.
Commissioner Beck.
Here.
Commissioner Zielinski.
Here.
And then, moving on to approval of minutes from our May 19th meeting. First of all, I wanted to compliment our staff for quickly turning this around because it was a longer meeting. So, and I guess initially I'll look at my fellow commissioners and see, did anybody have any comments once you did a review of the minutes? I guess a comment that I had on page 9, and this was under discussion about the property along Marine View Drive, the MS M2 split property. And towards the bottom of the page, I seconded the motion, but as I recollect, why I seconded it was more for a procedural consideration as opposed to anything having to do with the merits of the motion, because my understanding was in order for us to continue the discussion, we needed a second to Commissioner Zielinski's motion. So that was my intent. So if it would be all right with the commission, I would like to just add this phrase, to allow further discussion, comma, Commissioner Stewart seconded the motion. Okay. Any other comments about the minutes? Commissioner Tisdale? Nope. All right. There was some discussion that I don't know was included in the minutes regarding the alleys and access, and so I might just see if staff has a comment on that.
Yes, thank you. I would like to ask the commission what, hopefully you have clear recollections from 2 weeks ago. The one amendment where we discussed allowing retail sales in the Everett Station area zoning, we had discussed a potential amendment that dealt with a change under the current retail regulations to allow access from the alley and not requiring the parking to be located out in front of a building, only in this C2 Everett Station area zoning. And initially, staff had recommended against that amendment, but as the commission approved that requested change, we had a little bit of a discussion about that, but I don't know that it was included in the motion, and I'm just interested to see if that was the intent of the commission to make that change.
I think that my recollection, and I'm sorry Commissioner Holland isn't here tonight because I thought that was something that he had brought up, but yeah, concern about congestion in the area, and so I don't know if it's better to allow some parking off of the alley in this instance or not. Do any of the commissioners recollect what our intent was?
Well, I wish Chris was here because he was the one, and what I remembered of that as well as being consistent in with the other alley parking that's for other uses.
Mm-hmm.
And if I may, the reason for that request is also from the proponent of the allowing the retail use. His comment was that he has a much different situation than the typical alley interface between commercial and residential zones that you have along, say, Evergreen Way or Broadway, mostly Broadway, where you have an alley, which is the dividing line between residential on one side of the boundary and commercial on the other. In that particular area, there is no residential zoning, and so that was the concern of the City Council when they created that special regulation and although we discussed it, I don't think that it was clear from the action if that was included in the intent of the commission in allowing the retail sales in that zone. So if you don't have a recommendation or a recollection, that's fine. We'll take it to the city council without that being included, but mention it for their consideration.
Okay, I think that's fair. On page 12, I'm looking the fourth paragraph down. The last couple of sentences is where Commissioner Holland was talking about that, and he did ask if an amendment could address alley access in regards to the Pine Street property. So I think that is something that is in our minutes, and we'd appreciate if staff would bring that forward for the city council's consideration.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So any further discussion regarding the minutes from May 19th? Seeing none, I guess we're ready for a vote.
I would move the minutes.
I'll second that.
Commissioner Zielinski,
Yes.
Commissioner Beck,
Yes.
Commissioner Tisdale,
Yes.
Commissioner Adams. Commissioner Sand,
Abstain.
Chair Stewart.
Yes. All right, the minutes are approved. Next on our agenda would be reports from commission members, and we'll start down with Commissioner Zielinski.
No reports?
No reports.
I attended the Brownfield Site Revitalization Program. There was a presentation and/or some questions by the consultant, and it was very informative, and the planning department has again done a good job, and I think it's great that we're, excuse me, we're going to be able to clean up some of the contaminated sites from previous uses, and again, it's more of an era deal than it was anybody had done anything wrong. The best practices in those days were different than the best practices today, so it certainly is not because we had bad folks in town or there were bad businesses, and that will really help with what the PRC is pushing forward, that our numbers are going to be. It's going to give us some more land accessibility. And then also continue to participate on the South Everett Community Resource Center out on Casino Road, and today was our final meeting, and as Chris knows, working on the Streets Initiative, it's billed as a final meeting, but we restarted again. So anyway, it's going to be a good project, and it will really help that population out there.
No report.
No report.
And I don't have a report either. So moving then to staff comments.
Thank you. Yes, I do have a couple of comments. First of all, Dave Koenig last week announced that he would be leaving the city of Everett and going to work as a planning director for the city of Marysville sometime in July. And so we will definitely miss Dave and his expertise. He's been here for 35 years and is a housing expert, not just in the community, but probably better knows housing laws and programs, and understands housing as well as any planner in the state. And so we definitely will miss him and his participation here on with the Planning Commission. I'll be filling you in as time progresses, I guess, on what we will do to replace that position within the department, probably look at some potential changes in assignments. We do have some openings that we have advertised for. We have a new planner starting with us tomorrow, not in that position, but we will update the Planning Commission as we make some changes within the department. The other thing I wanted to mention was our June 16th meeting. We would like to do another workshop on the comprehensive plan update. We think we will have the information from our consultant for the transportation element. You had a briefing a couple of weeks or a couple meetings ago, and not sure that we're going to have the final product at that time, but we want to talk about just, especially for our newer commissioners who haven't been through some of the workshops, kind of the highlights of the other elements and where we're heading with growth targets and so forth. And so that will be on June 16th. So with that, conclude my comments.
Okay, thank you. And then we have time for citizen comments, and this would be comments that don't relate to our three items on the agenda tonight. Is anybody interested in speaking this evening? Seeing none. Okay, so we do have three items on our agenda, and item that's listed as number 3 is the 6-year Transportation Improvement Plan Review and Recommendation. I've heard that it's going to work out better schedule-wise if we go ahead and move that item number 3 up to item number 1, and then we'll take our public workshops on the code amendments after that, if that's okay with the rest of the commission? Okay. All right, so our agenda item number 3 is now item number 1, and it's, we'll hear from staff regarding the annual review.
Go ahead.
Okay. Richard Terry with Public Works. I'm here for my annual visit. The 6-year TIP is a state-required reporting document that is a financially unconstrained list of projects that basically come from the transportation element of the comprehensive plan and Transit's long-range plan. And new to the list this year are from the about to be part of the comprehensive plan, the marine port element. So the unconstrained list is $572 million worth of projects. $150 million are the new port projects. And you'll see the port projects on your cover sheet down under marine port. They're the bold items, those 3 items under port marine industrial. And there's 1 item under non-motorized, which is the Central Docks Public Pathway improvements. 1 project came off the list from last year. It's the East Everett Walkway project. All of the other projects that were accomplished and completed from last year were construction projects that fall under the different programs that you see. And we typically spend about $9 million a year on our transportation infrastructure. Our major project this year is the Broadway Bridge, and so it should be completed by the end of the year, but might go, it will close out in next year and be officially closed by the council. And so I like to keep things on this list. Because it's a rolling list anyways, it's more significant that the project just stays on the list rather than where it is located. And this authorizes city staff, mainly me as the main transportation grant writer, to search for funding for any of the projects on the list in any of the phases that are appropriate for that project, wherever it is along its timeline.
Okay, thank you very much. In terms of the process, I know it's mentioned in our agenda that there's a Transportation Advisory Committee. Do they review this prior to it coming to the Planning Commission?
Yes, they've reviewed it and recommended it for approval on May 21st, at their May 21st meeting. And it was also discussed as it relates to the transportation element because the consultant was there working through the pieces that the TAC is commenting on or working with the consultant on.
Very good. And then since this year now it's containing, includes projects for the marine industrial transportation improvements, does the Port Commission also have some role in reviewing these projects, proposed
They
projects?
don't have a role in reviewing the projects prior to council, but they're on the list because port staff, in dialogue with city staff, these are the projects that we wanted to include on this list. Once we become more familiar with that process, there's a marine port element and it sort of evolves. The list will get a little more detailed and have some process. But this is the city's TIP. There are projects on here that the city isn't going to do, but we are important to the city, like projects that WashDOT would do on I-5 or other areas. And so while we send this to them, they don't have a concurrence requirement.
Okay, thank you. Any questions from the commission?
You mentioned that typically about $9 million is spent per year on transportation improvements. Is that city money or total dollars?
It's total dollars, so it'll be city funds, state funds, and any federal funds. It could be including overlay. It could be projects where we leverage public works, meaning utility side projects, water, sewer, stormwater.
So that's
and
money
so-
from all sources, basically?
All sources, yes.
Other questions, comments? Commissioner Sam?
Richard, I was trying to make a comparison between the front sheet that had the port projects on the bottom and then the kind of the listing that was.
Okay.
Are the port projects listed in here? I didn't find them.
Port projects are not listed there because we're working towards how we are going to show and work with the mapping and some of the other things. So this was sort of late in my process when I knew I was going to be adding the port projects. And so,
Okay.
and because it's not a financially constrained list, we're not actually citing these projects at this point. They're sort of larger kinds of planning. We will next year, both with our transportation element changes and then the marine port, we'll kind of be adding that. But at this point, I don't have that, other than a rough estimate of cost.
And then I was looking on the website for the description of these projects as to what they really entail, and I didn't find that location. Is that out there somewhere for the public to look at?
So by description of each and every project, some are described more closely if they have a phase under or in progress, so PE, but there aren't specific, other than the map, which may show the termini and approximate location, they're sort of broad, low level of design. So the idea is that we need to do something in that area, but it hasn't been scoped or a broad description or a more defined description. It's more broad and vague. So I don't have one for each and every project.
Okay. And then I know there's been a legislative request put together kind of countywide through SCID and Economic Alliance.
Yes.
Are those projects identified in some fashion here as to what their priority is, other than the priority number? It appears that by project type, they're prioritized, but not overall within the, for all projects.
It's more important on this list, the way the city does the TIP, that it's on the list. There's not a priority ranking. It's just one of 9 projects or one of 10 projects. It's not prioritized. They get prioritized based on, as we build lists with our other partners, like you referenced, the county and others, then those become priorities as we move forward to the legislature. This list isn't treated that way. It's more that the projects fit in each of the categories. One of the reasons we do that is because we never know what the criteria for federal and state funding will be in any given funding program. And so this allows us to be flexible and pick and say it's on our list, but we move things up and down, and we work heavily to figure out what the priorities are, especially on the list that is feeding into any potential transportation package that may come out of the state.
So the priority that's listed here by project type is that a product of staff review of it or the transportation committee or past?
They come out of the transportation element, so there is some level of, I wouldn't say prioritization per se. It's kind of older projects first, or projects that were thought up, and it sort of moves up the list that way. I can't say that what was a priority when this project may have touched the first 6-year TIP up to 15 years ago, that it's in that same spot, but it still has some level of concern for the city. It may be a heavy lift, like something on I-5 or something to do with the trestle, but.
And then the last question I had to do with ST3 work. I
Yes.
know the city's been talking with Sound Transit about its preferences for alignments and extensions and all that. And I thought there would probably be some type of project or program in here for ST3 advanced planning, where the city would generate information that would help in the dialogue and to kind of frame the desires of the city as far as ST3 planning and eventual funding and implementation.
That will be more, we'll have a better description and be a major part of the list after the new update to the transportation element. There are things in the transportation element that will do some of the sort of designation of preferred locations and preferred routing that can inform this list. It has existed on here, and I was going to look for, there used to be under transit, and I just work with transit staff to do this. They did have a couple of sort of high-capacity transportation projects, but those aren't on anymore. I've come off of their list, and so certainly that will be part of our list going forward. But it was basically to use the transportation element to feed this list to sort of stay with the process that the city has used to form this list over time.
So if there was federal money out there for that type of advanced planning work for a high-capacity system, would we have to amend the 6-year plan, or could we find some general descriptions that would just kind of allow that money to flow to the city?
General descriptions, and we would also probably work with Sound Transit to support getting funding and grant funding through to them, because they would need, it would be most effective if they were the ones that were spending that money to plan routing. So we could use it as leverage, but it would be, that's sort of the strategy that we've been using. We support appropriate grant applications and process through the countywide federal grant system that Sound Transit applies for. And so we sort of use that right now because of the distance between today and when the actual EIS and some of the other things will start. So in next year's TIP, it will be formed a little differently, and we may even have just a high-capacity transit segment, but we don't currently have that, or haven't for a while.
I think that's a good approach, because it's been my experience that it's good for the local community to spend a little bit of their own money or some dedicated grant money to get the ball going and get the ball rolling down the right path. So, good approach. Thank you.
Other comments, questions? Commissioner Adams?
I have a real quick question. With the Bond Street closure at the crossing on BNSF, I notice on, I think you have the Bond Street pedestrian bike improvements. What is that as it relates to that closure? Is that?
That is a project in the vicinity, and it was at one time, there were grant funds to do a design. The city was partnering with BNSF and working through a way to make that connection. And it became more expensive than grant funds available. The railroad at the time changed some of their requirements for what they considered a safe crossing. And I believe, I wasn't part of the project, but I believe it may have quadrupled the cost. And so it's still on this list because there's a willingness by the city to attempt to find a way to make that connection. We didn't want to drop it as a project, but it is in discussion with BNSF, as almost all of their rail crossings are at any point in time, based on what their business needs are or their perception. And so it's sort of a dynamic process, and that's where it's at this point. We're in dialogue.
Okay.
And they closed their right of way, so.
Okay. So in terms of the 100,000 that's proposed for that, is that based on the number that's historically been on this list, or have we increased that number for purposes of going out and finding a grant?
We can increase that, but again, this is a financially unconstrained list, and so it's a number that we use to, essentially we'll be back to beginning at the beginning with this project. That number won't limit us if suddenly we decide and work with BNSF and there's a way to make the project go and we find a funding source. The number then will be whatever it costs to do the project.
Perfect, thank you.
Other comments? Commissioner Tisdale?
On project number 64, that's the 36th Street BNSF rail line. That shows 2.8 million. That's
Yes.
like almost 30% of the $9 million. It's typically I know with the riverfront project, now starting to take place, is there any, excuse me, is there any talk about how that moves to get those individuals from down there into the core of the city and/or down to the?
So where that project sits right now is that was the last number that was used in our grant funding process for construction of a bridge that essentially goes over the railroad right-of-way and underneath Interstate 5. One of the issues that delayed the project, and we actually returned some federal monies because we wouldn't be able to use them in time for how the region shares their federal funds, so we turned them back in for another project to be able to go. So that is at about 40% design. What it's waiting on is where it will land in the riverfront site. And so it just has stayed along the 36th corridor. And the dollar amount may change, but there's a number of issues there with it. And so once we turn back the funds, we're sort of on hold with that. And so that 2.8 is reflected from that last grant process. And so it was funded for some right-of-way, but really the right-of-way there is more of a discussion with Interstate 5. There's a trail lease required to go underneath or over or around any interstate. And so that's where that project sits right now.
Thank you.
Real quick, just so I understand, so this third column where it says priority, that's mainly just a numerical system for keeping up with the projects, how they come onto the list? It really isn't a prioritization of projects or anything?
No, it just
Okay.
it's used that, and then the other one that's important is if it has a map, what the map number is. And then the
And then
map
the-
numbers are in the bottom of the
And then
page.
the other columns, PE start, right-of-way start, all those are kind of dreams if the funding
Yes.
becomes available.
Yeah, the asterisk there that says they may be partially funded or not funded at all. And so at the time, if a lot of money were to fall out of the sky, we would start. But some of these have had some level of planning, some level of preliminary engineering, so they may have a much earlier date that says PE started several years ago. It may start and stop.
Okay.
So
So-
I try to
and-
use that a little bit to keep a historical perspective on how long it takes some projects to move from the first time money touches it to when we get done.
That's probably an interesting timeline. So the criteria in terms of how you're prioritizing projects, that's pretty much the Transportation Advisory Committee? Are they creating the criteria with staff recommendations? I mean, how are you prioritizing?
It really comes out of the transportation element. So in each of the elements, as you're looking at the comprehensive plan, there's typically categories of projects, and they typically do the, near term, medium term, far term. And so those are put in place based on that. And then over time, as other projects get completed and come off the list, it may bump up a number, but the numbering system it's not like the next one in line is going to get funded. And so but it's a way to keep it categorized and organized so I can keep track of the amount of projects and maps. So it may be priority, just a word we can change, but it's just the list of projects.
So, and can it be opportunistic if you see an opportunity in terms of a federal program? If there's a private development and somebody wants to partner? I'm just kind of curious. Do you
Yes,
think-
and that's exactly how the list gets used. And so there may be something vague that will show up as a program or an improvement or a corridor that's looked at, and then as it becomes more narrowly defined, if I know the project is going to be Broadway between these two cross streets, then that will get added as a separate category and we'll move towards that. But we will work with funding from whatever, if it's development money that also is leveraged by an LID, which could be leveraged. We put together all kinds of funding plans to work through and accomplish projects. And usually there's lots of different colors of money in any big project. So, but it is opportunistic. It's a reading of whatever the criteria are from the federal or state government or any other opportunities. And so.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a couple of additional questions. The first one is, I noticed that a number of the interstate projects, the city is listed as the lead agency. Does that mean that the state would not contribute towards that project, or merely that the city is the primary pusher for it, but that if you can bring the state along, they'll kick in most of the money?
Yeah, it's more the push the large rock up the hill. Everett is trying to move the project forward, and there may or may not be state prioritization of that project at this point, or they may have it in a different time frame than the city would prefer. So, and so then we would try to get to some level of whether it's a design study or some kind of a study to move forward. And sometimes we use the leverage of the legislature to add a few dollars to WashDOT's budget so that then we use our grant funds to get together and start a process. It's how we approach something like the US 2 trestle or some of the other improvements that have occurred along I-5 in the past.
Okay, great. My second question is, will the transportation element include something that's something like the 6-year plan that is financially constrained?
I believe that with the new, I know I've had discussions with the consultant. It won't be, it will be more financially constrained than this list. They're starting to require that it at least be feasible over, and I don't remember the number of years. But so, and that's part of one of the things that will probably change for next year, where I show that the city is leading on that. It will show a percentage, the city's percentage of that project will be the really big number that I would say. So I could envision next year saying that this is 300 million of city, but the projects are much larger. And so it's a little bit constrained, but it is still just a longer range planning document. And some of these projects, no one has done enough detailed design to know exactly what the cost could be.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have a resolution, if we're ready to entertain that. Are there other questions or comments?
I have one more quick one. This is just a minor correction. On your principal arterial, on your priority list, I think you're missing number 6, just numerically. So you list 11 priorities, even though there's only 10 projects.
Okay.
All right. Commissioner Sand?
What would Exhibit A be comprised of? Would it be this package, or?
That's a reference in our resolution.
Yes, the Exhibit A referenced in your resolution is the package that Richard's been speaking about tonight.
Okay, so do I hear a motion to approve resolution number 15-05?
So moved.
Second?
Commissioner Zelinski,
Yes.
Commissioner Beck,
Yes.
Commissioner Tisdall,
Yes.
Commissioner Adams.
Yes.
Commissioner Sand,
Yes.
Chair Stewart.
Yes. All right, the resolution recommending adoption of the 6-year Transportation Improvement Program for 2016 through 2021 has been approved. Thank you. All right, and now we move to the first of our 2 public workshops this evening. We will be looking at proposed code amendments for the zoning code, and it's the definition of family. I'll let staff explain that. Thank you.
Good evening, Alan Giffen, Planning Department. And a couple meetings ago, it might have been in April, where we asked the Planning Commission to initiate consideration of a code amendment related to the definition of family. And so I want to talk a little bit more about that tonight. We're not recommending taking any action. And as I talk a little bit about the nature of the changes, I want to call to your attention that I did put a couple of documents on your place there tonight. The one that relates to this item, potential zoning code amendments related to definition of family, has some legislative format recommended language for that definition. I'll talk a little bit about the highlights of those changes here with the PowerPoint, but you can refer to this two-sided document or sheet of paper that will talk about those. Well, we were doing our audit of the comprehensive plan. One of the items that the state wanted us to look at was the definition of family. Our definition had not been amended to include licensed adult family home or licensed family foster home within that definition of family. And that's based upon some changes in state law that we hadn't incorporated yet into our zoning definition of family. In addition to those two edits or amendments that were identified through that process, the definition of family is something that we oftentimes have some challenges when it comes to enforcing some of our land use regulations, particularly as and we noticed a real uptick during the recession where we had a lot of foreclosed homes that were being purchased, and the new property owners were I guess making a business model out of renting individual rooms to people more like a rooming house rather than the standard image of a family, the traditional family, or under our current definition, we also allow for unrelated people to live together and meet that definition of family. However, the current definition requires that in order to meet the city's goals for how a neighborhood or housing single-family homes in particular are not, without getting into how people maintain their household, we really had a different model than meets the definition. We had a number of houses in all parts of the city where landlords were renting individual rooms to people who had really no relationship or household relationship with the roommates within that house. It was more of a rooming house and not a single housekeeping unit as our definition requires. And we've had a lot of enforcement issues related to not only just the land use code, but building codes, fire and safety codes. And so our interdepartmental code enforcement teams have decided that we wanted to do a little bit of cleanup of that definition so that we can have a little bit better handle on managing those situations where the code was not intended to allow for rooming houses in a lot of our single-family neighborhoods. And so that's how the meat of this, probably the majority of this is come together for you. So the proposed changes to the definition of family would add the two items that have been identified in the state audit, the adult family home and family foster home. The current definition still or does limit the number of unrelated adults in a dwelling to 4. And so that wouldn't change, but one of the things that we would change is that it would eliminate the phrase "not more than 8 disabled persons" from that definition. And that was put in shortly after, I believe it was in the early 90s, that a landmark case that involved the city of Edmonds versus Oxford House, the U.S. Supreme Court made some landmark rulings about the ability of not your traditional family, but unrelated people to live together if they had disabilities. And so the courts and then through the Department of Justice made some rulings that local jurisdictions must follow in their definition of family or how they regulate the composition of households within their cities. And it's in order to allow for reasonable accommodation for people with disabilities to live in a community, the city is required to look at those situations a little bit more carefully, a little bit more liberally than the standard definition of family as it pertains to unrelated adults. And so when we amended our code back in the early 90s, we added up to 8 disabled persons as meeting the definition of family. What we're proposing here is to eliminate that number, but add a provision that any numerical limits would not apply if it would prevent reasonable accommodation of persons with disabilities. And what we do is, in such a situation where we have people with disabilities, and it can be anything from physical disabilities to recovering drug and alcohol abusers, which is the more common occurrence, and as long as they're recovering and not currently abusing, they would qualify as disabled, where, like an Oxford house, they live together in a sort of a supportive arrangement where they can help keep each other from falling back into the habits or the challenges that they had where they were abusing alcohol or drugs. And so typically that's where we are asked to grant a reasonable accommodation to exceed the number of 4 unrelated adults within a household, so that we're not discriminating or not granting the accommodation of those disabled individuals the opportunity for housing in our community. So it's a long-winded explanation, but it is something that we have reviewed with our own legal department and outside legal counsel, and found a definition actually from Edmonds, where they were on the firing line for the Supreme Court case, and it's worked well for them. Another change in the definition would also include some things that are excluded from the definition of family, such as group homes, rooming houses, and housing that is used in lieu of incarceration, but for example, a common name might be a halfway house. So if somebody was and we're not using that in the definition, but where instead of sentencing for some offense, you might have a group home for youth who would be living in a supervised situation. And we have a separate group of regulations, a separate group of definitions under group homes that provide for that type of living arrangement, but it's not included in the definition of family. One of the terms that is used in our current definition is the phrase single housekeeping unit. So when we have unrelated adults who are living together, and the code says as a single housekeeping unit, then that would constitute the definition of family, or compliance with the definition of family. And we needed a little bit more clarification as to what that meant. And so that, rather than, again, going to the rooming house situation where there's no relationship or even responsibility shared amongst people in a rooming house, within a definition of family in a dwelling unit, the single housekeeping unit would require that all the members have common access to living, kitchen, and eating areas, that household responsibilities and activities, maintenance and expenses are shared. And if the dwelling unit is rented, then the household members must jointly occupy the unit under a single lease. And again, that's just to avoid the rooming house situation that had become a problem. I think it's subsided a little bit, but it still is a challenge for our enforcement people. One of the things that needs a bit more refinement before it's ready for any kind of decision, and why we're just doing a workshop tonight, is to refine our definition of rooming house, and perhaps even establish some regulations for rooming houses. Some of our peer jurisdictions within the Puget Sound have spent a little bit of time with this recently, and we want to study some of their code amendments and see if there is a need or desire for us to incorporate some of the changes that they have made. But we already have a definition of rooming house. We would propose, at least for the purposes of discussion, something along the lines of the second bullet point. The top bullet point is the current definition, and I edited out a couple of things just for the sake of fitting it on the screen, but that would include a phrase about meeting a current housing code and about compensation. So that's just an abbreviated definition. But the second bullet point is the proposed definition, or at least for consideration as we work through this, it'll probably change somewhat, would be a non-owner occupied dwelling in which rooms are offered for rent or lease on an individual room basis. And that's more typical of the model that we've encountered in a lot of our enforcement efforts over the last few years. And so, again, that rooming house is something that would not be included in the definition of family. And in our existing code, just to point out that we already have this provision at the bottom of the page, and this is right out of the code directly. It says, in single-family zones, the rental of rooms for lodging is limited to 2 roomers. There shall be no separate kitchen facilities in rented rooms. There may be a need for us to revisit that regulation as well as we consider all of these potential changes. And so wanted to bring those to your attention tonight. We will have a bit more work to do. We've got, as I mentioned, our interdepartmental team that comprised of the building official, fire marshal, code enforcement, planning, and our legal department that are working on this one. We would expect that there would be some further refinements, if not to all of the definitions, at least to some of these, and perhaps, again, some of the regulations as they currently fit in the code. There may be others that I haven't identified here that will come up as we discuss this further internally, and we would bring those forward to you in a future public workshop to discuss. And then when you're comfortable with these at some point in the future, we would then have a hearing for your action. So I'll pause there and see if you have any questions for me, any of the problems that we might be dealing with, or any suggestions that you may have for possible changes to the draft definitions.
Any comments, questions from the commission? Commissioner Zelinski.
Alan, I just have one question on the definition of rooming house, where you specify non-owner occupied. I'm just curious about that, the use of that term. If the owner happened to be living there, but in all other respects it looked like a rooming house, it wouldn't be called a rooming house? And
that's a good question, actually. I thought about that as I was purloining that definition from another municipality's code. And that's why I added the other section of our code about rooming in existing single-family zones. That's a little bit more typical that you might see in parts of our community. The rooming house model that we have seen, most of the landlords wouldn't dare want to live in the same conditions that they have people living in. And that is, perhaps a judgment that maybe shouldn't be in the definition, but I can see where that could be a situation where owner chose to live in their own rooming house. That's
I think
typically
back in the golden era of rooming houses, it was not uncommon to have the owner be in the house.
Yeah, we don't see any boarding houses anymore. We do see the rooming houses, but boarding where they actually provide meals is, I think, a notion out of a bygone era.
Other comments? Commissioner Adams?
This is kind of unrelated to what you're asking in terms of some of the definitions, but in the first paragraph, you have the word handicaps. And I know that handicap is a defined term in that for Housing Act. I'm not sure the way that it's used there is appropriate anymore. And I'd ask that you talk to legal counsel about changing it to disabilities.
And we have used disability, but it was actually from our outside attorney that recommended using the word handicapped, because that's how the federal, it's either the Federal Fair Housing Act or the case law that uses that term. And so I believe it's the Federal Fair Housing Act that uses that term. So it
I think that they're wrong in terms of how it's used there. I think you should check again. And I say that because handicap, a defined term in the Fair Housing Law,
Okay,
Fair Housing
I
Act,
see.
I think would be
Handicaps, okay.
appropriate. But even when you go to the U.S. Justice website, like I did today, you do not see the word handicap anywhere where they define the section that you're talking about. They use the word
Okay.
disabilities. So-
Appreciate that feedback and that research. Thank you.
Commissioner Sand?
Alan, could you go over again whether there are numerical limits on the number of occupants that can reside in such a facility? And I understand the need and the value of having reasonable accommodations, but do I understand there's no limit in that particular consideration as to the number?
That is not correct.
Okay.
First of all, for definition of family, it would allow for any number of related individuals living in a dwelling unit, and that could include foster children, exchange students, and non-family members as well. For the reasonable accommodation, there has to be accommodation, but it also has to be reasonable. Reasonable not only for the people who are seeking the accommodation, but reasonable also for the neighborhood. So, for example, I can think of 2 or 3 situations where we have granted reasonable accommodation for up to 12 people. But these were houses that were very large, had a large number of bedrooms, and in at least the 2 that come to mind right off the top of my head, the residents did not have vehicles that where you had people parking all over the lawn or all over the neighborhood. And so we have to look at each one of these requests on its merits based upon the disability and the dwelling that is being proposed for accommodation. And not only that, but also we ask the proponents for their house rules and how they will manage just the living expenses, the living arrangements, the maintenance, and so it does ask for, that process does ask for quite a bit of information to make sure that we're not having someone just waving a piece of paper saying, oh, we're handicapped, therefore you have to grant us unlimited number of people living in a dwelling unit. It's not that loose or that vague. We actually do limit it to a certain number.
So it's a staff decision, but it's not an appealable decision. If in my neighborhood, someone wanted to come in and take a standard Rambler house, 4-bedroom house, and have a large number of folks live there, and the staff approved that, what would be my process to appeal that decision?
Our ability to excuse me, let me back up. The reasonable accommodation has to be something that does not create a barrier to people with disabilities from being able to enjoy housing opportunities within the city. And so for a standard residential home, we don't ask people to go through like a hearing process, and we can't do that for reasonable accommodation. That's why it is a staff reviewed thing, but it's a planning director review process, although we don't provide the notice that we would if it were under our procedures code, a review process too. It's something where we do establish some conditions upon a grant of reasonable accommodation, but they have to be, again, reasonable and on both sides, both toward the neighbors and toward the people that we're trying to accommodate. And so there is no opportunity for an appeal of a city decision there. Well, I suppose somebody could appeal, but I'm sure the hearing examiner would say he doesn't have the authority to rule on an accommodation case.
Is there a review, a 2-year review or a 1-year review, just to verify that the conditions that were?
We do ask for, I believe it's quarterly reports that we still have what the number of residents have been on an average for that quarter. and that the, the need for the accommodation still exists. And typically, if there were problems with an accommodation, the neighbors would let us know about it. That's how we have found out about some of these things that have started without a request for accommodation, and that's how we often get people channeled in that direction and end up with some limits. Oftentimes, we have the proponent wanting to house more people in one of these dwelling units, but we do an inspection of the house and we make sure that it is reasonable. We don't want there to be overcrowding or just a situation where we feel that it's too many people to live in a neighborhood. But we've been, I think, fairly liberal in allowing in a couple of cases up to 12 people to live in a fairly large house. But typically, the property owner or the proponent has asked for a greater number. But for building code reasons or other reasons, we have placed limits.
So does the accommodation run with the property or the owner of the land or the operator of the property?
It runs with the, I guess, the tenancy of that specific dwelling unit in that location with the residents. It's not something where a property owner can get a reasonable accommodation for 12 people and then next year have a totally different type of tenants who are not disabled and having 12 people live in that dwelling unit. It's not something that's transferable.
Okay. Thank you.
Other commission comments?
Just one comment. Alan, I think it might be helpful for the commission when you come back with looking for action, if you could, on these definitions, if you could show where the term is used in the code. I mean, I know some of these terms may occur in many places, but kind of the key provisions where this definition will come into play. I think that providing that context would be helpful.
Sure, we can do that.
So since this is a public workshop, I'm just checking with the staff, we have an opportunity to hear from any members of the public on
Sure,
this?
yeah. We would encourage any public input that people are here tonight if they're interested.
So I think I'll move to that, see if anybody would like to give us some comments. So we do have a half sheet that I'd like you to fill out if you would like to address the Planning Commission on this item tonight. Anybody in the audience want to? Okay. All right, so any further questions? Done? Okay, so I thank you very much. And
Bring this back to you in, probably a couple months' time.
okay.